2023 U.S.-led invasion of the country. Jana Raff has this report.
For Danny Fitzsimons, it could have been so much worse. Hours after he arrived in the country 2 years ago, in a drunken rage, he shot and killed an Australian and British co-worker and wounded an Iraqi guard. That's not in dispute. The question was his state of mind when he did it. The verdict, not death by hanging, but life in prison. In Iraq, though, that means just 15 years, a far shorter sentence than he likely would have received in the West.
We respect the independence of the Iraqi judicial system and note the court's verdict and the sentence. We will continue to offer consular assistance to Mr. Fitzsimons. At this time, we should also remember the families of those who died in the tragic incident Mr. Fitzsimons was on trial for.
His lawyer here says it wouldn't have gone nearly so well if the trial hadn't dragged on for a year. A year ago, the legacy of the U.S. security firm Blackwater shooting dead 14 civilians in a Baghdad square was still very much alive. It led Iraq to ban the company and put strict controls on private security firms. When it came time to negotiate a new security agreement with the U.S., it made sure to insist that the immunity they always had be dropped. Post-traumatic stress disorder isn't widely understood here. Most of the country probably suffers from it. Fitzsimons' lawyer says the court decided that while his client was mentally competent, the horrors he'd seen as a British soldier in Kosovo had left him deeply troubled.
Danny
is sick. He has lots of illnesses. If you read the medical report, the British medical reports, and the reports from the medical committee, says he has been exposed to very ugly scenes in Kosovo. This illness makes the one who has it feel like everyone else is his enemy, and the slightest provocation will have dangerous consequences.
And then there was the drinking. He drank a liter of scotch when he opened fire on his colleagues. There are still tens of thousands of private security contractors in Iraq. For most of the war, they were immune from being prosecuted here. But now Iraq has responsibility for its own security. And with this ruling, they've made clear they will administer their own justice as well. Jana Raff, AlJazeera, Baghdad.
Well, over in the U.S., prosecutors on Tuesday will retry two former private security guards who worked for a division of the company that was formerly known as Blackwater. They're accused of murdering two Afghan civilians and critically wounding a third. In the first trial last year, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Tom Ackerman reports.
Christopher Drotleff and Justin Cannon were hired by Paravant, a shell business for the company formerly known as Blackwater. Their job helping to train Afghan soldiers. That was until May 2009, when an incident left two Afghans dead and the contractors fled the country. The two Americans say they fired their weapons in self-defense at the Afghans riding in a car which rammed their convoy and then tried to run them over. An Afghan pedestrian was also hit at close range and was among the dead. Prosecutors say the Afghans' car was never a threat, and a U.S. Army review found that the two Americans had been drinking that night and violated weapons policies. The incident was not the first involving questionable weapons use by Paravant Blackwater employees in Afghanistan. Official U.S. reviews have accused other company personnel of unauthorized possession and reckless use of Afghan military weapons. The chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee said Blackwater was actually damaging, not helping the Afghan training mission.
And if we fail to make sure that contractors like Blackwater play by the rules and live up to their commitments, we'll be doing a disservice to our troops by making their already difficult and dangerous job even more so.
Levin has urged the Defense Department to reconsider its award of a potential $1 billion contract to Blackwater for training Afghan soldiers. But both the State Department and CIA last year awarded Blackwater and its shell companies new contracts to guard their facilities in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Afghan President Hamid Karzai has set a 2-year deadline for all foreign security contractors to leave his country. The retrial of the Afghan shooting case follows a U.S. judge's dismissal of manslaughter charges against other Blackwater security guards working for the State Department in Iraq. Investigators found that in 2007, they killed 14 unarmed civilians without provocation, but the judge ruled that the evidence was inadmissible. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in Pratap Chatterjee. He's a columnist with the Guardian newspaper for more on that case. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. So what's different about this trial? It's the second time around.
Well, I think it's actually a good thing that the U.S. is actually prosecuting these cases. It's not the first case to be prosecuted. David Pissarro, who was a CIA contractor, was in fact found guilty a few years ago for beating a man to death in Afghanistan. And so we'll see what happens with this. But the fact of the matter is that most of these cases that you've in fact shown on just now fall into this legal sort of limbo, because these are Americans, you know, operating in another country where in fact sometimes they have immunity. In Iraq, for example, the U.S. set up a rule called this Coalition Provisional Authority Rule number 17, which gave them immunity. And so where in most countries any kind of killing would be prosecuted in its own courts, in this particular case the people who are involved, alleged in the killings, have been able to escape to the United States and escape prosecution. So today, because Christopher Drotliff and Justin Cannon are being prosecuted, it shows the U.S. is taking seriously the fact that its nationals have been acting with impunity abroad.
But in the U.S., laws also state, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but that prosecution is possible only if those accused were working inside U.S. military bases. So there is still a bit of a loophole in the system.
There is still a loophole in the system. They were actually contractors working for the Department of Defense. Therefore, the Department of Justice can prosecute them. In this particular case, it's been possible. But let's say they had been working for the Department of State. It's not quite as clear that they could have been prosecuted. So there's a lot of limbo, legal limbo, shall we say, in bringing these cases to justice. And in fact, you can see in neighboring Pakistan, in fact, that the U.S. government is trying to argue that its contractors, the CIA's contractor, Ray Davis, should get diplomatic immunity, even though he was involved in a remarkably similar incident where he shot and killed 2 Pakistani civilians. So even though the Department of Justice is taking a good step forward in prosecuting Justin Cannon and Christopher Drotliff here, I'm not sure that we can assume that the U.S. government will always do that. They have not done that in Pakistan.
Just briefly, what do you expect the verdict to be?
Well, I think partly because the judge is asking the jury to, is thinking of allowing the jury to consider manslaughter, it may be easier to bring a verdict against them. It's fairly clear that they've been drinking, that the people they killed were civilians, and that they should never have had those weapons in the first place. But it will ultimately rest on the jury to decide whether or not to convict them as opposed to the judge. So if there is a possibility of declaring manslaughter, which is a lesser charge, there is a chance that they may convict them. But if they don't, I think that the people would assume that justice is not going to be served to American contractors.
All right, Pratap Chatterjee, thank you very much for that. Well, Kyrgyzstan is facing another spring of discontent as its new government struggles to get a grip on the economy. Food prices are soaring.